Welcome back to the Resilient Virtual Book Tour. It's my pleasure and really honor. I've been kind of following her for quite some time now, so it's amazing that we get to connect. But it's my pleasure to introduce my next guest, Nathalie Molina Nino. Nathalie is an entrepreneur, builder capitalist, and a tech globalization veteran focused on high growth businesses that benefit women and the planet. She is the author of Leapfrog, the new revolution for women entrepreneurs, and serves as a venture partner at Connectivity Capital Partners. Welcome our next guest, Nathalie.
Hello, it's such a pleasure. I have to commend you and your team for getting me a copy of the book before this. I wasn't able to get all the way through it, but I am a good speed reader, and I took a quick look, and I'm glad that our paths intersected because I think we're talking the same language, and you're probably my people. I hope I'm your people.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that we're part of this new guard of people that are realizing that there is more than one way to do things. And your book, I have to just say, first impression was tremendous. I can't wait to finish it.
Yes, and I have been reading Leapfrog, and throughout I'm like, yes, same type of lessons I learned from my grandmother, same honing in on just being from what generally people have felt as like underrepresented backgrounds, and people have tried to box you into certain categories of what you can or can't do, or expectations that we essentially are like breaking out of all of these stereotypes that have generally been put on us and kind of creating our own paths. So likewise, I definitely think you are my types of people, and I'm so happy we can have this conversation. And so want to kind of kick us off on that same note, and you talk a little bit about your upbringing and background in your book, but would love to just hear from you kind of your story growing up here. I know that you are the daughter of a Latinx immigrants. So would love to know a little bit about your history and even how your family came to be here in the States.
Sure. I love telling that part of the story because it starts with a matriarch, right? And it starts with a Latina who, funny enough, always charted her own path. I think in the 1950s in Ecuador, which divorce is still not looked upon kindly in Ecuador today. I can't even imagine what it was like in the 50s. But my grandmother divorced her husband. He was not a good husband. And years later, when her kids were adults and she already had grandchildren, so my grandmother was more than a grown-ass woman. She was a grandmother already. She decides that she's going to come to the US and she's going to bring all of her kids with her. And it took over 20 years, but one by one, she came, she brought the first, the second, and their spouses and their children. And she managed to bring all 5 of her children to the United States over the course of almost 20 years on the salary, and really not a salary because at that point, I don't believe that she was a full-time employee, but on the wages of a seamstress in the sweatshops of Los Angeles. She was a master seamstress. She could make wedding dresses and quinceañera dresses. And she did that as a side hustle on the weekends as well, which is how, she managed to do so much. And so that's how my family came to be. On the other side of my family, our Colombian family, very similar stories. So Colombian and Ecuadorian, South Americans, very humble beginnings, showed up in this country and worked really hard and taught me what it was like to be one kind of entrepreneur. So we're talking manufacturing, we're talking factories, right? We're talking about a very specific kind of entrepreneur, which is still very much the lifeblood of this country. But I decided to do something different. And so when I went off to college and then started my first company, I went into tech because I really wanted to do something in my mind that was different than what my family had done. I had seen them work so hard. I had seen them get so little rest. I had seen how many sacrifices that they had, given to these manufacturing, hard-working companies, that I thought, let me go and do something different, something that is maybe not as challenging. And little did I know, tech startups.
Just kidding.
Yeah, they're not super easy. And the hours I worked make my family, give me still to this day a hard time about how hard I work, which is ironic. But at the end of the day, I think you get bred into that hard work is important, and it's really hard to take that out of you. And I actually think that as much as we love our ancestors, as much as I love my culture, my family, we were a no English allowed household. We were very, very, adamant and passionate about preserving our culture. And I'm still very adamant. I keep homes in South America. I'm very closely connected to my family, both in Ecuador and in Colombia. But I will tell you, I think that if you're asking me origin story, I think that one of the things that's really important to me in telling that origin story is that what got us here is not necessarily what's going to get us there, right? And that's part of the moral, I think, of the origin story with my grandmother in the book, right, where I talk about her. And I don't know how much you want me to go into it, but I talk about my grandmother basically saying that, right? And I love that because it feels like my grandma was in some ways giving me permission to say, you don't have to follow exactly in these footsteps. The whole point of everything that I'm doing is so that
you don't have to
take it to the next level. Exactly.
Yes.
So, I think sometimes we get confused, and we almost replace these origin stories with the story that has to keep repeating, right? And that's not true. I have my own version of the 80-20 rule, which is what I say, that you can honor your ancestors, you can be proud of your culture and where you came from, and you can take 80% of all of the beautiful things that you were given, by the people who came before you. And then there's 20% that you are allowed to leave behind and push forward with, right? There's 20% that you're also allowed to say, no, thank you. My grandmother, bless her soul, was definitely racist. I'm going to leave that behind. I'm going to honor my grandmother and everything that she stood for, with the exception of a couple of things that I think that I can do better with. Right. And that's one example. It's like, you don't have to take it all forward. And I think that's a really important part of the legacy.
And I think that's so important, because when we think about, I'm from the South, and so, being from the South, being a Black woman from the South, being a solo founder, being all these things, right, that people have linked on me. I think about like my family and how we grew up, and how my, grandmother, she didn't have an education over the fourth grade, basically. And that's where her reading level stopped as well. And very similarly to your grandmother saying that, I'm working this hard so that you can go off and get education, you can do these other things. And I also talked to a friend of mine. She is first generation Vietnamese American. And she talks about how, when her family came over here, they had a very small restaurant, and they actually don't want their kids to go into the restaurant business, because they're like, this is all we knew day in and day out. We had no life, and we did this to give you a better life. And when she told people this, people were like, oh my gosh, your family's restaurant is so known in the community. Like, how could you just like not keep it going? And also feeling almost a responsibility in ways because of what others may expect on you. And for some communities, that is the case, right? They do expect you to follow the family traditions. And it was just so good to hear her family and her mom and father like, no, actually.
What a privilege, right? How lucky that she's being given that freedom. I think, to your point, not everybody is given that freedom, and how lucky for those of us who are. But even those that aren't, you just got to take it.
It's
right?
okay.
You just got to take it. And that's the other thing, is no one gets to choose what part falls in the 80% and what part falls in the 20%, right? That's on you. That's how you design your life, right? And how you design your businesses. And I think that keeps repeating, right? I mean, I think the same way that we get messages like your friend in her restaurant in the community, right? We get these messages of like, these are the things you should stick with, and these are the things you should leave behind. And other people don't get to choose that. People say the only way to grow your company is, equity investing and venture capital, and everybody's excited about, Shark Tank. And it's like, the world is not Shark Tank. And P.S., what people don't know is that most of the deals fall apart when filming stops on Shark Tank. Most of those deals don't even get signed. Nothing happens. It's TV, it's entertainment. And so I think that, there's just a lot to be said there around those same lessons, right? Like, you get to choose, nobody else.
And so, speaking of tech, and that's so very true, not just with Shark Tank, but I feel even with a lot of like the headlines and everything else that we see, no one really gets to see like what's under the hood and what's happening like behind the scenes. And to your earlier point, how very hard building a startup can be. And so you have described yourself in the past as a recovering tech entrepreneur. But how did you actually come into tech? What was your introduction into tech? I'm curious to know that.
Yeah, I mean, I am a self-taught. I mean, I studied engineering. I was an engineering student in college, and then I went to grad school to study cartography. I was very into maps. I was. It was also a time when like GPS and GIS were just starting to become commercial. It was a really exciting time, but we had, me and many of my friends, who were sort of geeks, basically, we had self-taught ourselves to code. This was the early days of the internet, right? We're talking, well, of the commercial internet, starting to be widespread. So we're talking about like 96, right? I'm self-taught. I've made some websites for the university, getting paid, whatever, student, wages.
Right.
And so I'm making websites for fun. I'm also making websites for a little bit of extra cash. And then I have a motorcycle accident. And my only form of transportation in college is a motorcycle. So I have a problem. And this is, I think, an important story for people who like to hear that origin story. And a lot of times, especially with any big successful company, people go back and they rewrite their origin story, and everybody wants to write that romantic story about how they built it in the garage. Never mind that, Bill Gates's garage was a mansion.
Right.
Or Zuckerberg, right? Like, people rewrite these origin stories like, and the stars align. My origin story is like a lot of people's origin stories. It's necessity and scrappiness and having very little other choice. My only form of transportation was a motorcycle. I get in a motorcycle crash. I have a bum knee and a bum wrist, and I can no longer ride a motorcycle, and I still need to get around. So I go to this, very sad looking little used car dealership who doesn't have a website. And I noticed that obviously his big competitors, so the big Toyota dealer, the big, Mercedes dealer, they do have a website. Now it's basic, but they have websites. This guy is this little used car dealership, definitely doesn't have a website. I look at, the car on his lot that I want, that has an automatic transition, because remember, I have a bum wrist. And I noticed that, I have about half of what he's asking. So I can't afford the car. And so I go to him and I say, I'll give you half of what you're asking for this car in cash, and the other half, I'll make you a website. I noticed you don't have one. And no school taught me that.
Right.
That was
bargaining chip.
Scrappy. That's grandma, that's mom and dad. Like, that is scrappy family coming out, right? Of saying like, well, see what he says. Worst that can happen is he can say no. And to my surprise, he said yes. And then he told a friend, and then that friend told another friend. And next thing you know, I had more website businesses, contracts than I could do. And so I brought in, friends, and boom, I had a website development company, right? And because we were geeks, and because of, software companies being cheap, and instead of doing beta testing at the time, they were sending their pre-release software to big universities like the ones that we were at. And we were getting access to Visual Studio before it was released to market, right? We were getting access to building database-driven, SQL Server-based, websites. So like, the beginning of really sophisticated web development, where you're actually putting true software online and doing transactional things. And so we got lucky, and we built a business on that. And I was 20, and I was in college, and eventually I dropped out of school to do my startup full time. I didn't know if that was a good idea or not. And again, I'm not going to pretend and go back and write the story and be like, I knew, like, right. I didn't know, but this internet thing, it seemed like maybe it had legs, and maybe it wasn't going to go anywhere, and maybe it was a good thing to pursue, right? And so I took a chance. But more than anything, I think the important thing for me in that story is that I had no choice. I didn't have money. I needed a way to get around. I couldn't tell my parents I had a motorcycle, or they would kill me.
Now you're supposed to have one to begin with, so the story after that is non-existent.
Nope. So, it's not the most romantic story, but it's the truth. And I think it's also the truth that a lot of entrepreneurs live with, right? Sometimes out of necessity comes creativity, and comes businesses, and come, an entrepreneurial life. That's what happened to me.
Yeah, I think that when I think about how I got into entrepreneurship, it literally was I was doing this work, I was recruiting other people to help me with it. And then they're like, man, you're kind of good at this. Would you mind doing this for us? And I was like,
Mm-hmm.
well, yeah, I guess I can do that. And then one thing led to another, next thing led to the next. And next thing you know, I'm starting a business. Although from my roots, I always feel that I was very entrepreneurial just because
Mm-hmm.
that's where my father was an entrepreneur. My brothers, they were entrepreneurs. Although all of the rest of my siblings today they have gone a different path. They're like,
Yeah.
entrepreneurship is not for me.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm like the sole ranger here,
Mm-hmm.
in the entrepreneurial game. But
But
there's
you know
still
what I
leading me
like
on.
about what you just said, and this is important, I think, especially with communities of color, is that we are often in rooms where the legacy is around us, right? Like I went to and ultimately ended up teaching at Columbia, and how many times did I see people in the room sitting next to somebody whose grandfather's name was on the building, right?
Mm-hmm.
That, and so that Latinx student, that African American student, like they're not a part of that legacy. But one of the wonderful things I think about entrepreneurship is that unlike a lot of other things, many of us have the ability to say I am, and we don't say it because we don't realize it, but we
Mm-hmm.
actually can and should acknowledge that we are third, fourth, fifth generation entrepreneur. Like many of us truly are, right?
Yeah.
And you don't think of the fact that my grandma had this side hustle making quinceañera dresses and wedding dresses, or that, other members of your family, like you don't think of them as entrepreneurs the way that we think of entrepreneurs now, and who's on the cover of Fast Company and Inc.
Yeah.
magazine and so on. But they absolutely were. And I think there's something to be said about the fact that we have many communities of color. We have a rich legacy in the space. And it is almost a legacy that we can claim to be uniquely ours, right? I
Yeah.
mean, right now, I cite the statistic all the time, but I never get tired of it, right? Women are starting businesses at twice the rate of men, and 8.9 out of 10 of those are started by women of color. No
Yes.
one is more entrepreneurial than women of color. So we're not the exception. We're not the outlier. We're actually the majority.
Yeah. And oftentimes, in many ways, when we look at that same case in other scenarios, we are the majority.
Mhm.
But then it's like, how do we take back our power? And I think what I've read so far in your book, Leapfrog, is like, how do you, and even speaking to myself, so many things I just didn't know, right? I wasn't aware of until I
Mhm.
found out, or I had experience and I was introduced to something that, okay, this entrepreneurial world, the landscape of fundraising, capital, who receives it, is designed this way by people that don't look like me. And that's why the barriers are so hard to break through.
Mhm. Mhm.
And if it wasn't from my experiences, I may have a different opinion about why things are the way they are. And I think that you talk about this in Leapfrog, and I would love for you to talk a little bit more about what women are missing, right? Like, what are we missing that is something that you became very aware of along your journey, and how you want to like bring women. And I don't know if it's like bringing women to the table, but oftentimes I feel like we aren't in the game, right?
Mhm. Mhm. Uh, I love that question because I went down a path searching for this, right? So people who know me today know me as an investor, but as you said, I'm a recovering tech entrepreneur, and my path to investing started with me thinking that what women were missing was a whole series of tools, right? And in some ways, I acknowledge that there is some truth to that, right? And that's why I
Mm-hmm.
went to the trouble of writing down 50 tools and putting them into a book and getting them published. But the other thing that I realized is that when I went around, and I had the privilege and the good luck of building curriculum that ultimately I co-created, and I worked and collaborated with the Obama administration on what was then called the United States of Women, right? The United States of Women decided to kind of take the show on the road and to go to all these different cities around the country, right? We went to Albuquerque, we went to Columbus, Ohio, we went to Philadelphia, to Atlanta, and all these amazing places. We started in Chicago. And over the course of that, I ended up doing a lot of my workshops in front of and in collaboration with thousands and thousands of women entrepreneurs. And what I realized is that, yes, can anyone benefit from more mentorship, from more education, from more knowledge? Absolutely. But after being in front of thousands and thousands of women entrepreneurs and people wanting to be entrepreneurs, it occurred to me that they didn't have any less than that punk kid at Stanford who, because of an idea on the back of a napkin, got handed $3 million.
Right.
So yes, education is important. Yes, content, like the amazing content that you have in your book, or the stories that I put in my book, and the hacks, like, yes, they're powerful, and yes, they're important, and we should be arming our community with all of the tools we could possibly arm them with. But what I came to the conclusion of is that ultimately that isn't the biggest obstacle. The biggest obstacle is really simple. It's money. Yeah. And we're not getting it. And we are consistently not getting it, right? How is it possible that the group that, like I said, starting businesses at twice the rate of men, and 89% of those businesses are started by women of color, how is it possible that the single most entrepreneurial demographic in this country is getting, in the case of Black women, less than 1% of all venture capital? And if you look at bank loans, the numbers are not different. If you look at private equity, it's even worse. Like, all the asset classes and all the different kinds of funding, a teeny tiny minority of which is venture capital, even though they like to talk like they're everything.
Right.
All of the different forms of capital are giving a tiny, tiny fraction of it to the single most entrepreneurial group. And so to me, that's what women are missing. Women, and especially women of color, are missing capital, and we need to be thinking of every creative possible way to fix that problem. And it's not, again, the only problem, but in my opinion, it's the biggest.
So do you think that we should, and I'm pulling just some past conversations that I've had out of my head. I was a part of a Women's History Month panel in which the majority of the women that were involved in that panel essentially have given up on venture capital. And they're like, you know what, this is not where we're going to find funding. And until they're ready to play well with others, right, we're not going down that route. What are your beliefs when it comes to accessing the capital? Because it's one of those things, like, I'm a big believer of like creating our own tables, but I'm also a believer of, well, if you're making the rules and if you have the power that could impact my life, I want to be at your table too. And so I'm always like balancing between how do I get resources, information from people who are still in power, because we haven't put other people in power to replace them, so that we're not left behind. And then how do we build our own tables? But from the instance of capital, we know that venture capital VC is broken. Do we try to fix it, or do we create these alternative routes?
So the best example that I can give you, and it's rooted in one statistic that no one seems to want to, I don't know, just accept, is that when we talk about funding companies, it doesn't even matter. Let's take, demographics out of the equation. All companies, white-led, black-led, Latinx-led, whatever. Venture capital represents 0.05% of all business financing. So if you were to come to me and tell me, Natalie, we did a research study of yacht sales, and we've discovered that if Black, Latinx, other people of color go to try to buy a yacht, the system is totally rigged against them. It's super racist. They're horrible. I would tell you that really sucks. And we should fix that. Like, somebody should
bigger fish to fry.
but I'm not gonna lie. Like, I'm not gonna lose sleep over that. Yeah. Not because it's okay that there's racism and sexism. It shouldn't be there. Somebody should fix that. But if you ask me what I'm gonna prioritize, I'm gonna prioritize the 99.9 whatever 5% where most of us live, Black, white, brown, whatever, right? Like, you've got a teeny tiny, rather insignificant niche of the world that knows that because 70% of all venture funds do not successfully return their investors' money, right? the only way they survive is by getting a ton of media attention, by putting a press release out every time
Yeah.
they write a check to an entrepreneur. Like, really, that's newsworthy? Like, I would
Yeah.
rather see an article about somebody who got $1 million line of credit. Why? Because
Mhm.
the line of credit is a sexy ass thing. Like, I get money, I don't have to give up, equity in my company. And then when I
Right.
spend it, I can go and spend it again. Like, I can't think of anything sexier than line of credit. But when have you seen an article in TechCrunch about somebody getting a line of credit, right?
Yeah.
Objectively, it's better for the company in almost all cases, but it's not
We don't
newsworthy.
talk
And
about
that's
it.
just because, and so I guess that's my thing, is I think that it's not that venture doesn't matter. It's that we have bigger fish to fry, right? We
Hmm.
have so many people starting companies that can get all sorts of capital. And I am like you. Like, I believe that you need to build new systems and build new tables, but you can't just ignore the current system as it is, right? Which is why I think it's important that more women, and especially women of color, become investors. But can we please become not just venture investors? Can we
Yeah.
become investors that deploy debt? Can we become investors that deploy builder capital, which is an alternative form of, different and separate from venture capital? Can we look at people doing revenue sharing funds, right? People allowing founders to be able to buy back equity in the future. Are there different ways that we can start investing, like crowdfunding, which women are disproportionately more successful at crowdfunding, right? I talk about
Yes.
that in my book, and I talk about that every chance I get. Look at what Arlen Hamilton just did,
Yeah.
in the last month. Like, there is a reason that women are more successful at this. And I think for the pragmatist in us, the one that says, yes, we have to think about the future and build new systems, but what about the here and the now? Well, to those people, I say, awesome. In the here and in the now, women are being more successful at crowdfunding. So let's double down on that, and let's put a
Hmm.
bunch of energy into that, because that is an area where we have seen traction, and we have seen that the needle is able to move. And to your point about like waiting for people to figure out whether they should invest in us or not, I'm not waiting.
Right.
I don't think that we wait. We're gonna
Move
end up
on.
waiting forever. What we do is we make sure that we get more of us writing the checks.
Absolutely. On Friday, I was in conversation with Jill Burke Solomon, and she has what she considers alternative fund. I'm an LP in Collab Capital. And when we sat down at the table, and she was telling me, what about the businesses that could get to $10 million? What about the businesses in our communities that can get to $20 million? Yes, we want to invest in where she traditionally came from, the startup world, but what about the other businesses? And I was like, oh, count me in. Like, this is these are the businesses that I grew up around. To our point about our parents and our grandmothers and our mothers were entrepreneurs, and they did it differently than what we naturally see today. But all of these different entrepreneurial classes, and not being boxed into like one single
Yeah.
thing. And I think a lot of startups, particularly because they couldn't access capital before crowdfunding really became a real thing, their companies died, right? And they never really got to truly see what they could have become had they had those additional resources.
Yeah, and the framework that says that if you grow to 10, 20, 50, 100 million, you're not a failure, right?
Hmm.
The VC fund structure is structured where it's about the unicorns, and it's about portfolio theory, and it's about, what Peter Thiel, which, think about, the messenger there, right?
Yeah.
Calls spray and pray. It's like, you can be a part of that, that's fine, but I am very adamant that, at least for me, and I think that I have a lot of other, colleagues in this boat, I would rather look at solutions to try to raise up 1 billion people than to create 1 billionaire, right?
Hmm.
Because if you really believe, and, if you do, that's fair, and I know that there are a lot of people that do, but every modern economist that has any credibility has disproven the existence. Like, this theory is right up there with, the tooth fairy and Santa Claus. Like, if you
Yeah.
believe in trickle down economics, if you
Yeah.
believe that you make 1 billionaire and suddenly millions and millions of people get to benefit in some way, then what you're selling me is trickle down economics. And, I
Hmm.
didn't buy it when Reagan was selling it, and I'm not going to buy it when anyone else is
Yes.
selling it to me. Like, it's 2021. Come on. Like, I personally want my energy focused on raising up as many people as we can. And those $10 million businesses, as you and I know, they brought us up. They helped me go to college. They are the reason that so many of us exist, and they're out of reach
It's so true.
of a lot of people still, right?
Yeah, it's very true, particularly when I think about there's always these stats that get thrown around, but one that continues to populate is the wealth gap and between Black and Brown people, and how that number will be the widest it's ever been in the next like 10 years, right?
Yep.
I think that technology, a lot of things play a role in where we are, but significantly the wealth gap that has continued to progress as billionaires became richer during 2020, right, during the pandemic, while others couldn't even access jobs or resources for their families. And I think about the idea of like leapfrog, right? I'm like, okay, how do we close this gap faster? How do we begin, even if we never close it, how do we afford more people opportunities to then help other people? And when I think about like leapfrogging, giving like resources and ideas and just like some know-how to help other entrepreneurs, to help other women, to understand in many ways like the landscape that they're playing in, and as well as other images and models that they can use to help them become successful, or to help whatever they're doing succeed. Because ultimately, it's about what does success look like in your realm, and then what does that mean for the individuals around you.
Yeah, and I hear what you're saying in terms of like defining success on your own terms. That's super important. But I also want to push out there that like even by anybody else's measure, right? When I profiled my friend Nina Vaca, right? She has $1 billion company, and when I say $1 billion, I'm not talking about some random ass valuation that somebody in, Silicon Valley pulled out of where.
Right.
I'm talking about she has $1 billion in annual revenues.
Yeah.
Right. Her company is now in 10 countries. She is the single owner of the company because she never took one penny of venture capital. Right. And so I guess, yes, there is honor and there is dignity and there is an important role that smaller businesses have. But I also want people to understand that if you're super ambitious, if you have your sights set on building a big high growth company, you can still do that the way that Nina did. Like there are alternative ways that frankly aren't that alternative. Again, remember 0.05% is what VC represents, right?
Yeah.
Everybody else is not an alternative, right? There are lots of other ways to grow businesses. Her company Pinnacle has been multiple times voted by Inc. magazine the fastest growing woman-owned company in the United States. So you can't say she's not growing fast. You can't say that she's not big. You can't say that, it wasn't all done in her best interest in terms of retaining equity. She runs her business her way. And I think that those are the sorts of examples that just they're not common knowledge. They're not, she is not a household name the way that Zuckerberg is. And I think that part of the job, and I love that, somebody like you did the thing and then you wrote the book, right? I think that it is on us to not just do the thing. We have to do the thing, and then we have to go out and scream from the rooftops about not just what we did, but what's possible, what our friends are doing, all of these sort of alternative models, which again, I go back, they're not so alternative. They're just not being discussed. They're just not being put on the covers of magazines and in the subject of the books that profile the same for entrepreneurs, talking about the same for startups, right? It's on us to tell those stories so that people see that there's another way.
Yes. So you said something also in your book, make something that people want and then use your fat bank account to indulge your passion. That stood out to me because I always say that it's actually like a privilege to not have to like worry about money, and just like to just go out and do something that you're solely passionate about, right? I was like, oh, people say that from a place of privilege, but would love to know your thoughts around that quote that I read that you said.
That comes from a chapter that was inspired by my friend Nellie Galan that I believe is called Follow Your Bliss is BS. Because all of these Instagram, influencers that say, follow your bliss and everything will magically work itself out. It's like, okay, like when I was a little kid, I loved ponies. Like, should I have started a company about ponies? Is that a thing? Because that's follow my bliss. Like if I had done that, would that pay my mortgage? Would that, I think it's unrealistic. And I think, like you said, it's based in privilege, right? It's based in this knowledge that you could just whimsically go off and do whatever you want and everything will magically work itself out, which is true when you have a safety net, which is true when you have a trust fund, which is true when you have wealthy parents who will catch you in case something catastrophic happens to your career or to your bank account. Yeah. Or any of the other things that are used as safety nets, right? For most of us in the United States, we don't have safety nets. We really don't, right? Many of us can't even move in with our parents, right? Many of us are paying our parents' mortgages. I mean, these are things where it's very different for the majority of people in this country. And so this idea that you should just follow your bliss and everything will magically fix itself, I think what we need to be doing, and what the quote that you specifically mentioned, it comes, I believe, after me talking a lot about how we need to be building businesses rooted in real problems being solved. If it's something that drives you crazy, if it's something that's solving a real problem in the world, then you're probably landing on something that's a viable business. But then after that becomes the question of, well, what if I want to start a nonprofit? And look, I am going to be controversial here, and I know that a lot of people won't agree with me, but if you are not a billionaire, or if you are not on your way to being, somebody with a lot of disposable income, please do not start a nonprofit.
Yeah.
Nonprofits are subjecting yourself for the rest of your life to asking people for money. Like, even the long-standing sustainable nonprofits, like think about the Girl Scouts, even they said no more to charity. They took matters into their own hands, because if you think about it, like, what the hell does cookies have to do with girls' leadership?
But it's a good entrepreneurship hustle.
Correct. Like, now we think Girl Scouts and cookies, like, of course they're super connected, but think about however many decades ago, right, before somebody decided, the Girl Scouts are just going to sell cookies. This is a way for them to have control over their own destinies, right? The different affiliates, every sort of regional Girl Scouts is a little bit different, but I remember talking to the woman who was then the CEO of, I don't know if it's the Northeast or the New York region for the Girl Scouts, but they choose every year. This year, we're going to rely 60% on Girl Scout sales and 40% on grants. And the next year they could change their mind. This year it's going to be 80% cookie sales, 20% grant. The point is you control your own destiny by being an entrepreneur, and you can do that by being in a nonprofit sector, like in the case of the Girl Scouts. You can do that being in a corporate environment. You were saying earlier, like, even before you started your company, you were entrepreneurial. You were, that was just the way that you moved in the world. And so I feel really strongly, especially for our communities, especially for women. There is a problem. There is a very big crisis right now that women are getting to retirement age and they are not equipped financially. They do not have retirement funds. They are at risk of being in significant danger, right? Of not having healthcare, of not having roofs over their head. Like, the level of poverty in women at an older age bracket is really concerning. And so when I see more and more women, especially women of color who don't have safety nets and don't have trust funds, going into the nonprofit industrial complex, I worry. I worry for us collectively. So like, by all means, start yourself a nonprofit after you've made a bunch of money and you have a bunch of, extra. Please. But
and we work with so many foundations, like family foundations, who generally have been started by people who have accumulated wealth, where now they're giving back through this legacy vehicle, right?
They're not losing sleep.
No.
They're not losing sleep. If they didn't raise as much money, if they didn't, launch a campaign or do something, the ones that even raise money, as you know, many of them don't raise money. They're just in the process of drawing down their wealth. If you don't have wealth and you're starting a nonprofit, you are subjecting yourself and everyone around you to an undue burden of pain and suffering. And I want better for us. And I know that I have many sisters and brothers who are in the nonprofit industrial complex. Fine. We understand it. You're doing good, meaningful work in the world. And I, for one, will help and have supported many because they're great causes. But for future moves, I think that there's another way. And I worry a lot about our ability to sustain ourselves. And so it's on us to support those that are already in there. And if I can influence others to get out or to not go in at all, I would love to do that, because I really do worry. I worry about making the thing that sustains you and your family be charity. And as we saw, look, pandemics happen. Like, who saw 2020 coming?
Right.
How many nonprofits just don't exist now? And that's people's jobs. That's people's livelihood, right? Gone. because
Absolutely.
a bunch of somebody's just decided, hey, we're in a pandemic. This is no longer important. I'm going to cut off the funding for this nonprofit that I used to fund, right?
Yep. And we saw it happen. And, when I talk to friends and they're always, because we work in the philanthropic space, they're like, oh, I'm interested in starting a nonprofit. I'm like, does that nonprofit already exist? And can you volunteer? Because it probably does exist and you probably haven't volunteered yet or even saw if there is a need in your community for it, right? That you can actually solve for. And I think that's the bigger factor that's into play. Can you actually solve for the problem that exists, or would your talents be best used as volunteering when, on the side to organizations that are already actively doing that? So I am definitely here for that. So you
or in the career you're in, right? Like, what if you're in if you're in a for-profit sort of, environment, is there the activism that you want to do outside of work that can be done internally? Some of the most powerful activists are people that we've never heard of, that are some middle manager at some massive corporation, right? The day that Walmart decided to make all of its vendors have X percentage less packaging in order to, cut down on the use of paper, like, no one knows who that person is who pushed that through, but the entire supply chain connected to Walmart, reducing their packaging by 30% or whatever it is they did, like, that one move probably did more to save trees and the environment than a lot of other people that have chained themselves to trees. I'm not saying that one is not meaningful. I think that we need activists on the front lines, but we also have to acknowledge that there is activism to be done in these odd places, like, the supply chain manager at Walmart, right? Very different kind of activism, but equally valid.
Yes, my friend Phil, we were talking, well, he says, everybody doesn't want to be an entrepreneur. And he tried, and he was like, no, corporate America is my space, but this is how I'm going to help businesses led by people of color. I have the ability to ensure they get that contract, that they, have opportunities to sit on boards. And so utilizing his power and connectivity inside of, which is Amazon, to do that is significant, because we know that businesses don't need just funding. They need contracts, they need customers, and they need a whole bunch of other stuff that isn't necessarily connected to a monetary investor check.
Yeah. We need people. Everybody needs people on the inside.
Yes. And so, speaking of people, is there like one individual that stands out in your career where you're like, because I met this person, it introduced me to something, it opened up a door for me that just always has stuck with you?
Yeah, so many. I mean, I'm saying only because
I don't know. Where do I start?
Look, reinventing ourselves is challenging, right? Starting new careers, pivoting in really big ways. And pivoting isn't even the right word. A friend of mine recently posted something that I loved, because pivoting assumes you keep one foot, in the sort of same place, and then you kind of pivot and shift. Some of us just jumped and started something completely, over again. And I don't even know that she knows it, but my partner, who I co-founded this Center for Women Entrepreneurs inside of Athena at Barnard at Columbia University, she's a legend. And when I met her, I was so intimidated and impressed. This is the woman who saved Roe v. Wade in the United States Supreme Court in 1992. If you go to law school, and if you've been to law school anytime after 1992, you probably studied this landmark historic case called Casey. And she argued that case, right? And so here I am, I'm meeting somebody who like is in the history books, like a living legend. And what was interesting is that I was in the process of starting over. I had left tech. This is when I started to say I was a recovering tech entrepreneur. I didn't want to come back. I never would have thought that I would have gone into investing at the time. But she kind of gave me a swift kick in the butt, right? She basically said, it's nice you're taking some time off and hiding here in academia. I get it. You needed some time to heal and recover and do your thing. She goes, but you left tech no better than you found it. There are half as many women graduating as engineers today as when you were studying engineering. Like, you did not leave that place better than you found it. And it's fine for you to take a little time off, but you are in the unique circumstance of being one of the few that survived and thrived in that environment, and you can't just graduate out. You have to go back in the game and you have to fix it.
Yeah.
Nobody is in a better position than you to hopefully leave it better than you found it. And I think she, it was a little tough love. It was very much like, you don't get to opt out, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I might not have been at fault. I'm not going to, put all the, responsibility on me that tax didn't improve. In fact, it got worse. But I do hold myself accountable for trying to do in some way, right, the work of introducing solutions and making it better. And no better place than academia to look at the next generation and be like, it's for them. Like,
Yeah.
I can't possibly feed them to the lions and hope that they do better. Like, I have to be accountable for creating an environment, that was in some respects good to me. I grew up in tech, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that in some respects, the well has been poisoned and we need to clean it. And so I would say she, more than she even realizes, Kitty Colbert is her name, and she's also in one of the chapters in my book. She probably did the most to impact my life in the last 10 years, because she taught me how to be an activist, and she taught me that I don't have to choose between my career as a professional,
Mm-hmm.
um, and being an activist. I always thought you had to be one or the other. And she made it very clear to me that not only could I do both, I had to do both.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that I always tell, like my friends would tell you when I was in college, I was like, and still am, like, but a huge activist in college, at LSU. And
Mm-hmm.
just because it was just so much blatant, whether it was racism, discrimination, I was in college doing Hurricane Katrina. It was just a lot, right? It was a lot compounded.
Yeah,
It
you were
was
there
hard
at
to
an
not say
intense
anything.
time.
Yes, I was. I
Whew.
was. And so it's hard not to say something. And particularly just me feeling so embedded into like the community, not saying anything. And then when I got into business, it was always, what can you say? What can't you say? Will this hurt your
Mm-hmm.
chances to do this? Or will this hurt your chances to do that? And so I tried to and still try to move through life in a way that people, it's like, you kind of have to accept me as I am. And sometimes I
Mm-hmm.
get to the table and people are like, wait, we didn't know we signed up for this. We didn't know we signed up for this, right? But I'm like,
Yeah.
well, I'm here and I'm going to point out what you just said. Actually, you are completely putting your stereotypes, prejudice on an entire group of people, right? And so I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
oh yeah, I'm going to have to speak out on that,
Yeah.
and truly have stepped more into that as I have like matured as an entrepreneur and have navigated just the landscape as a whole. But I know that a lot of entrepreneurs are afraid to say anything. And I have friends who are like, when I exit or when I do this, then I'm going to like,
Yeah.
do X, Y, and Z. I'm like, okay, by then, what would have changed? We'll be on a whole other thing, although I'm sure a lot of things will still be the same, but not feeling like you have the ability to be both, right? And in many ways, the
Right.
ability to be yourself.
Right.
That's how I see it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and I think that what's interesting about that, and again, why I love that you wrote a book, right? Is that a lot of how that happens without deep career ending or startup ending consequences, because I have to honor that. If people are fearful of speaking out, I have to honor that it's for good reason. People do get blacklisted. People
Yes.
do, talk themselves out of deals and checks and all sorts of, like, there are consequences to being yourself sometimes. And
Yeah.
so there is a process that you have to navigate. And it also depends on where you are in your career, how much social capital you have. 20-year-old Nathalie was not as vocal as, Nathalie today. And that's partly because I can afford it. When I was out there trying to get, checks from people, maybe I was navigating the world differently. But one thing that I think is amazing about people speaking out, writing books, telling their stories, like you and your book, is just that people can ignore one of us and they can write us off as outliers, right? But once it becomes a chorus of us, once all the sort of sisters, lock hands and say, it's not one outlier, it's all of us. We define the market. We are the future of what business looks like. And you're probably going to have to get, on this bus rather than try to get us to conform into the broken world that you built, right? I think that there's such massive power in numbers that I think that's why it's important that things like this get written and that stories like yours get told.
Thank you. Thank you. As we wrap up here, just want to ask, what are you looking forward to? I know that you are investing. I know that you're working even to bring more women to the table, to reach more women. But what are you looking forward to? And what are you working on? What can we expect next, if you'd like to share even?
The two things I'm most excited about are, and the first one is a stealth company that for the last almost 4 years I was not allowed to talk about. And last couple weeks ago, they finally came out of stealth mode. And that's a company that is going to hopefully make history. It's going to take the birth control pill over the counter for the first time. Not just in the US, but there are 13 of the G20 that do not have the birth control pill available without a prescription.
Yeah.
And so by the time we're done, we hope to be in all of them. But the US is obviously the number one priority. People don't realize that the US is unique among all developed nations in that we have 48% of all pregnancies in the US are unintended, which is an embarrassment. And a lot of it is because people don't have access to simple things like the most popular form of birth control, and if you don't use it and if you don't like it, that's fine. But the fact is, most women choose to take the pill.
Yeah.
And you can't get it without, a prescription. And even, if you don't have health insurance or you have bad health insurance or you have an employer, that decides not to cover it, you have to pay out of pocket and it's expensive, right? And so that's probably one of the ones that I'm the most excited about because now that they're out of stealth mode over the next a couple of years, hopefully it'll hit the market and it'll be available and easy to buy as a Snickers bar. So that's the hope.
That's great. And I think about how the barrier, even for someone like myself, I remember trying to get like a prescription, like filled, right? And with the doctor I've always seen for the past like 10 years, it's like, oh, we have to schedule your annual first. And then when you come in for that, then we can give you another, which is insane.
There is no medical reason for that. Right. And that's why in most countries around the world, you don't need a prescription. So honestly, that is the thing that I'm probably like the most excited about, but I've been excited for a long time. And the next one is my next company, which, the details will, kind of come out and then over the course of the next year. But really, it's about what we've been talking about, right? It's about taking ownership. And it's about the fact that a friend of mine put together and found a stat, which I love, which is if the African-American community in the United States and the Latinx community, of course, there's overlap because a lot of Latinx are Black. If the two communities and the overlap between them simply worked together to bank with each other, shop from each other, loan to each other, right? If we actually built an economy, the power of just those two demographics and the size of the economy, if we were our own economy, is $3.9 trillion. It would be the fourth largest economy in the world, right? And so I want to stop seeing, it's not that I want it to stop. I want to not just see people throwing money at the problem in this post sort of George Floyd murder world, right? And I want to see us owning the banks and the insurance companies and the mortgage companies. Like I want to see Black and brown ownership of the infrastructure of the economy because I see a lot of money being thrown in a lot of direction in ways that are not sticky. And so my next project is going to be about BIPOC ownership of the actual inner workings of the economy. There should be a way for you to know that you bank, you mortgage, your pension plan, your credit card, like there should be a way of knowing that every single dollar that you touch and that you make is being managed by people from your own community. And that doesn't happen today, but my hope is that soon it will be possible.
And to even the point of the previous company coming out of stealth mode, is not only is it needed, but people desire the ability to be able to do it. And I think about even like my daily walk and me trying to find someone that does this as a person of color, trying to find a person that does this. We're fortunate in New Orleans to have a Black owned bank, Liberty Bank here that I can bank with, but it's not easy, right? Trying to pull it all together. And if we could make it so, so many more people will be so conscious of it and then do it to the point where it's just natural, right?
Yeah.
It becomes as natural as like going to a JP Morgan Chase over a Liberty Bank, or you go to what you have access to, right? And that's the biggest thing.
People of color represent 70% of the world's population, and we manage less than 2% of the world's money.
Yeah.
That's ridiculous.
Yeah. Insane. Well, sign me up. I'm there. Let me know when I can do my part.
Congratulations. I know we just met, but I'm very proud of you. And I'm so glad that you wrote this book.
Thank you so much. And thank you for just joining me in conversation. I will let Meredith, who connected us, I was super excited. I was like, what? She said, yes, I'm here for it. So thank you so much. I appreciate you taking out the time in your day. And I will definitely stay connected with everything that you have going on, and any way that I can lift up your work or be of support, I am 100% here to do it.
Thank you. Congratulations.
Thank you. Have a great one.